All right, it's time for another level 1 monitor review. This time, we've got the Viotek. Oh, I don't remember the model number. Hang on, it's an obnoxious model number. GNV34DBE. Viotek GN34DBE. Gotta watch the letters, maybe they'll change things, I don't know. 34 inch. This is curvature of 1500R, 178 degrees viewable horizontally and vertically. It's 21:9. It is 99% sRGB, 85% NTSC, 90% DCI-P3, 85% Adobe RGB. Yes, we do have the color calibration profile. We'll get to that in a minute. This is a dot pitch of 0.23175 by 0.23175 millimeters. Response time is 6 milliseconds, 144 hertz. So this is a Displayport 1.4 monitor. Yes. It's got 2 HDMI inputs, 2 Displayport inputs, 1 analog audio out, although don't recommend using that. It's about 15 pounds, including the packaging. So first up in the level 1 monitor review, how is it packed? It is very well packed. So if you're shipping, internationally, or you're worried about UPS handling, because you can't buy anything in stores right now because of the thing, it's well packed. It should get there in one piece. The foam is fully surrounds the display pretty much. Mine actually had a little bit of damage getting here, but the display, as you can see, completely fine. Assembly is pretty easy. Included in the box is everything you need for mounting to its very simple stand, which includes tilt adjustment only, but we've also got mounts for VESA. This is a nice touch. A lot of the time, especially with these curved displays, especially with more inexpensive stands, to get the VESA mounting, you gotta pay extra, or it's an obscure adapter. It's included right in the box with this, so if you wanna use this with a standard monitor arm or a wall mount or something like that, you totally can do that. Fit and finish, it's matte black plastic. It's not cheap feeling, but it's also not super high quality feeling. It's just a matte black plastic. It doesn't really seem to pick up fingerprints too bad. It seems to be pretty well assembled. There's not really a lot of flex, which is pretty good considering this is a curved monitor, as curved as it is. It does come with a nice little cable hider thing, so you can hide your cables at the back. And included is this little red piece of plastic, which works really great as a headphone holder. So overall, not too bad. In terms of the on-screen menu, got a lot of options. Looks kind of like the Korean monitors that we've reviewed in the past, but this is from Viotek. So you've got some options like FreeSync and an overdriver and other things like that that will let you fine tune the parameters that you want on a particular display. So without further ado, let's hook up the Leo Bodnar and see what kind of response time we're actually working with. So these figures are not the best, but they're not the worst either. We've got about 5.2 milliseconds, 6.1 milliseconds, something like that, for your initial input delay. So this tells me that this is buffering at about 1 frame at 144 hertz. The test signal that we're displaying is 1080p 60 hertz. So at the top of the screen, a perfectly ideal monitor, which doesn't exist, would be 0 at the top and 16 milliseconds at the bottom. And sometimes you run into weird things where the panel's always running at 144 hertz, but you have a variable amount of input delay. So this monitor delays about 1/140th of a second and then starts to display the frame. So this number for the bottom is perfectly consistent with what I would expect for a 16 milliseconds display time. So the display really is taking 16 milliseconds to display that for the Leo Bodnar. That said, a 5 millisecond input delay, really not too bad. It's about 1/144th of a second. So not bad, really it's pretty decent. Now you might be wondering, when you first get this display, why isn't FreeSync working? Well, you gotta go in the menus and turn it on. It's a little buried. It's in the standard place that it's in for monitors that have this on-screen control firmware, but you gotta go to FreeSync and you gotta turn it on. It's also a little odd that out of the box, the RGB range is set to limited instead of full. I set it to full, and that's what we ran our color calibration against. Now, in case you're wondering, because it's got 4 inputs, it does support picture-in-picture and picture-by-picture. So if you wanted to, you could use this display in halves so that you've got half the input from one computer and half the input from the other computer. There are some other picture-by-picture modes, but most people don't use those. There's an on-screen display that gives you some options. You get an idea of what functionality you have. In my experience, those kind of features are a mixed bag unless you're working with like the display software where you can really control your resolution on the host PC, because it can get a little weird, because sometimes it'll try to cram 1920 by 1080p signal onto the left side of the display, and that's not really half of 3440 by 1440, so it can lead to some really odd situations or a lot of wasted pixels. But it's nice that it has the feature. I mean, if you need it and you can use it, great. It looks like for our subpixel layout, we're dealing with RGB, because it kind of looks to me like there's a black line on the RGB side of the lagom.nl test. Also in the UFO frame skipping, we are seeing a couple of frames where, you know, there's 3 squares that are lit up. There's one that's starting to come on, and then the other 2 are starting to fade out. That tells me that the panel is probably running somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10 milliseconds when we're talking about black to black. But for the other frames where there's at most 2 squares on display, you know, best case scenario, gray to gray, 6 milliseconds, and that is what the manual says. Now for the backlight bleed test, we've got to go dark. We've got to go all dark. Oh yeah, that one's on a switch. I'll just steal a drink of coffee real quick. For the backlight bleed and color shift, I like to work in the dark. But we do the test, and from this panel, it's pretty good when you're dead on, but if you're way above or way below the panel, so if you're using this as part of like a monitor tree or something like that, I don't know that I would recommend it for sure, because you do get a little bit of a color shift and a little bit of a, well, it's more of a contrast shift than a color shift. So I set up a very dark background that has a little bit of a texture, a little bit of a pattern to it. It's basically just black and dark gray. And in terms of backlight bleed, the backlight bleed is quite good, but you do get a little bit of a contrast shift when you're using this monitor, so bear that in mind. So I think this is one of the higher end, you know, VA type panels, not an IPS panel, but still pretty good response time, pretty good color accuracy if you take the time to calibrate it, and not terrible color shifts. I mean, you're gonna get a little bit of shifting just because the panel is so curved. The manual advertises 178 degrees. You can get a pretty good picture out of it at some of the more extreme angles, but if you're sitting way above or way below the monitor, like if you're a super tall person, you probably would want to invest in a monitor stand to get a better picture out of your display. I mean, it does have the built-in tilt function. It's the only function that it has, but the higher you can get the display, the better the picture quality is going to be from your vantage point. So overall, buy, don't buy, what's the recommendation, what's the verdict? Well, it does pretty decently well as a gaming monitor, and it's better than average in terms of content creation or content production if you're worried about color accuracy. I mean, 99% sRGB all the way down to 80%, 85% on the Adobe RGB side of things. There are gaming monitors that are much worse than this in terms of color accuracy, so that's pretty good. 144 Hertz. Yeah, it's 144 Hertz. You can set the display refresh at 144 Hertz. The panel itself is really pushing it to be able to actually deliver true 144 Hertz, because, you know, we look at the high speed footage and we can see that we've got multiple frames on at any given time. The input latency of about 5 or 6 milliseconds, there are monitors out there that are better, but the buy no buy is going to come down to price and price in your area. Do the comparison shopping, look at the specs, look at the true specs, not what's published in the manual, because, you know, like we've seen with the Samsung U28D 590D, it's like, oh, it's a panel response time of 1 millisecond. That's lies. It's all lies. This monitor is accurate with what it has in its manual, which is nice. So this is, I think, the first monitor from Viotek that I've taken a look at. It's not bad. I like that its power brick is built in. I like that it has 2 Displayport inputs and 2 HDMI inputs. You know, if you're on Linux and you're doing the multiple graphics cards thing, because you're running a Windows VM, something like that, having the 2 Displayport inputs is nice. It's also easy to go through the OSD and swap between inputs. I couldn't get the DDC input switcher to work. I've got a little script that'll try to send a signal to the monitor through Displayport to try to switch the inputs. Couldn't get that to work with this monitor, so if you get that working and you want to share it with your Linux friends, come to the Level 1 forums and tell us what you did, because it should work. And if you do that, you don't have to buy something like a KVM to switch between, you know, your fancy display between Windows and Linux. You can just use the input swapper in the display, and you're basically good to go. All the keyboard switching and all that is easily handled, fairly easily handled in software. Not a bad showing from Viotek though. I mean, just it comes down to price. I kind of like the red LED on the back too. I'm Wendell, this is Level 1. This has been a first look at the Viotek GNV34DBE. So yeah.